Okay, folksies, let's look at Beastlord here. This is a Quinto fantasy game, and first thing off, I had a lot of trouble, had to bail, getting through any of it, dealing with it at all. And there are a number of reasons for this. Some of them are personal, and probably don't really relate too much. My overall mental state seems okay, given, that I had to run away from my home and leave half my game collection behind and stuff like that. I have my stress moments about that, but I think the main thing is, I've been doing some external gaming, and there's wonderful places to walk. There's a lot to do here. But even given all that, I had a fair amount of time to game, and was so sort of unhappy with the situation as I was playing this that I decided to go out and buy Witcher 3 and play that, and that definitely got in the way. But, the point is, this game drove me away from wanting to game at all, even if I had other issues. Now, it's not just this game. My lighting here is not good, and I assumed there's a TJ Maxx nearby. I assumed I'd be able to buy stuff there that was useful. And it turns out it's not what I expected it to be. It's a higher end households type version of what I remembered. And, I was expecting something kind of like Target, where, I could pick up a couple of cheap lamps at $10 each or whatever. Since I don't have a car, I kind of want things to be close if I'm going to be shopping for that kind of material. But there are other possibilities there. It's just I haven't gotten around to that, and that may be hindering my play as well as the game. Certainly, in conjunction with some of the component issues, that's part of the problem. Let's talk about the components, because I believe they are the thing that I most despise about this game. And the number one is the rulebook. The rulebook is standard Quinto style rulebook. Annoyingly tiny print, and set in 3 columns on a too wide piece of paper, and it makes it difficult to manage and deal with, either just for reading or otherwise. All the cases that they put in, think about the Avalon Hill case idea, where, each small concept has like a couple of sentences under one case number. SPI tended to kind of usually put more information in a given case. I prefer that type of version. And then you get to some other designs, MMP, well, the gamers, I feel like they do things rather well in terms of getting a lot of information in a single number. It makes it a little harder to reference specific things in bigger contexts sometimes, but overall that works very well for me. On the other hand, GMT does something that looks kind of similar, but is just not done in a fashion which communicates the information. But this is just ridiculous. This was taken to an extreme, to the extent that basically each sentence has its own index number. And there isn't a lot of cross-referencing, so those indices don't gain you anything. They just break things up. The rules are also, sometimes contradictory, sometimes ambiguous, where they talk about, they spend a number of sentences talking about something and never actually nail things down. I had that problem recently with the Labatt games. Well, here, though, let's break each sentence into its own individual line with a number, and then not necessarily mesh together particularly well. That made approaching the game a real chore. Add to that counters, which contain, and you can see them in the actual playthrough, but they contain an icon that's pretty important and very hard to discern one from the other in some cases. In addition, there's a fair number of numbers on it. They're not well printed. It's hard for me to read them. The choice of black on color sometimes works okay. In this case, the tiny little print, etc. It just, yeah, I find myself looking very carefully at the counters to try to, and even before my eyes started getting, old and worse, I had trouble reading these counters, or Yaquinto counters in general. They remind me kind of Task Force Games counters, which were really awful too. Play aids, again, tiny print. These aren't too bad. You have these suckers, hidden setup things. They function okay, but there aren't all the counters that you need. So, for example, there's no turn markers in the game. And one of the ickiest of all is this really hideous, garish map. I am lacking a component, which didn't help either, which is there's a tactical map. Now, I came up with a kludge for that using maps from other games, and it seemed to work fairly well, to tell you the truth. One of the big selling points of this game to me was it translates the strategic to the tactical. Now that has problems, and problems that I was kind of aware of because I've played other games of that nature, now with SFB, for example, where quite often you're fighting battles that you're putting too much emphasis on that little battle. And one of the problems is some of the game is meant that you could play the battles using either the strategic system or the tactical system, and you can kind of mix them up in your particular game. It doesn't really work that way. You don't get similar results necessarily. There's facets of the tactical game which can make the results come out very, very different. I guess the answer to that is you can negotiate a solution like you would in Titan or something like that, or you always default to the tactical battle and somebody could just surrender or whatever. There are surrender rules, which I didn't use because they seem pretty weak for the person who's surrendering, like their units are captured and now they can be slaughtered. But they have a value, they can be traded. Anyway, overall the components really made the game hard to face, hard to play. Looking at this map and trying to just cope with it, it's just hideous. And that makes me not want to play a game when the map's so ugly. The counters, not particularly attractive either, but very, very difficult to read. You end up with huge stacks of counters. There's no simple rule between counters of the same type, so you have them stacked by type because that's how the sieges and the strategic combat work. Well, they have different values on all the different counters, and you'll have such a large stack. I'm also not a terrible fan of Yaquinto's general production quality. These over-thick counters or thick counters tend to be, I find them more difficult to manipulate. They're all side-mounted, and they end up having really nasty little pieces. This is really minor, but when you add it all up, it adds up to something that really interfered with my enjoyment and willingness to play the game. All right, but what does it do that kind of works? What are the cool facets to it? Because there are a lot of neat things in it. And the first one is, hey, let's translate it to the tactical. Okay, well, one of the big problems with that is if you don't get the same results, something feels a little wrong, especially if you're allowed to kind of choose between the types of battle you do. One of the others is what I alluded to. Sometimes you're fighting a battle and it just seems like you're doing this waste. It's going to cost you 20 minutes to an hour to play out this battle, and it's pretty obvious what's going to happen. One side blows out the other. And this is perhaps in part because I was inexperienced with the game, so now I'm looking at it and I think I would not split my forces and only have one huge stack moving around the board as my big attack stack, and everything else would really just be empty dummies. Well, that leads to a very unpleasant sort of play where it's all about the guesswork. Hey, where's his big stack? Where did he move it? Because you can split off dummies and spread around the board and stuff. So that doesn't look terribly appealing. There's a fair amount of chrome in the game, but that's one of the places where a lot of the rules kind of don't quite mesh together. In the optional rules, there are things that it's not absolutely clear if they translate to the tactical game, how they work, and you're going to have to make a lot of decisions on that chrome based on, you know, just trying to use common sense, and it's not immediately obvious what the answer should be in some cases. Lots and lots of hidden pieces around the board, you know, these the stuff that's contained on these and that's hidden from other players. Obviously, that's what makes it a guessing game, and such types of games don't really appeal to me, but it is necessary, and the reason for it being necessary is one of the cleverest things in this game, which is each player has their own random victory point card. And that card tells them how much their pieces are worth to them and how much each enemy they kill is worth to them. This is actually really ingenious because there's a fairly large deck of these, and what it's going to do is it's going to generate different types of play and different types of game each time you play. Without that, the game would kind of feel like just a mega big version of some of these other little fantasy war games that weren't really, you know, terribly rich in anything, with a lot of chrome thrown in. You know, a lot of these special things. Hey, you can cast spells and get the dragon on your side or something like that. Well, most of that chrome felt kind of too painful for me to be terribly happy with it. It made the game less approachable. How much would it be worth if you play a lot of this game? Yeah, I think it would start to show some value there. I think that there are paths that players can take that chrome adds to, you know, the choices they have. For example, choosing whether or not to deal with the dragon or something like that. But that chrome also mutates the combat effectiveness of the different forces, and it begins to look like some forces are really significantly unbalanced, at least in direct comparison to other players, which means if you get the right, you know, card, and it may just be that there are certain factions that are just more powerful. Now, the fact that it's a 4-player game means that may not be that big a deal if everybody's really familiar with the game and knows, you know, what the worth of the different forces is, etc. If you've played it a few times and you have a pretty good hold on that, you can say, oh, hey, you know, the goblin is really dangerous. Let's take him out. You know, if that's the answer, that's like, you know, the wooden walls strategy's effect on empires and arms. Not that I fully understand that, but, you know, there are players who say, well, the first thing we have to do is take England down and just trash them because they're just too potent. Well, okay, you know, now if everybody's agreed to that, we have a problem with the game, you know, because the game now will always start with that kind of, you know, if there's a group agreement that that's the case, well, then whoever draws that power is going to be significantly weakened. And in this game, it's particularly a problem because the scoring in this game, these people upstairs who seem to run around in their boots, the scoring in this game is just based on what you killed, which stays permanently dead. There's no, you know, no production, nothing like that, which differs from some of the other games. Notably, Barbarian Kings allows some production. Most of the other fantasy games kind of seem to be like this, where you have a certain amount of force. You also have a time limit in terms of when you can get that score. You have like, what, 16 turns or something like that. I don't remember, 16 or 12. Yeah, 16 turns alternating day and night. Most of the game is pretty uninspired, but this really is a clever idea, and one that I haven't, I've seen. I've certainly discussed this possibility before I had seen this game, and I like the idea of games that have kind of hidden victory conditions, because this is hidden. You're drawing when nobody knows what you're going for exactly, and that with the hidden pieces, etc., allows you to set up to take advantage of your victory point card and score it as well as you can. I think that kind of idea is really neat. It definitely has the problem possible of a really unbalanced scoring distribution coming out. Like, if somebody's got better forces than me in general and they get to score off my pieces, and I maybe don't get to score off their armies, but I really care about preserving my own stuff, me getting wiped out could just put me out of the game, even though I've got some score from the other players. But you have a limited amount of time to rack up your points. The armies are going to decrease in size during that time. And there is a certain, one big stack can only do so much. And each turn it can kind of take out one enemy thing, right? Habitation or whatever. So maybe having that one big stack isn't the best way to generate points. But it does seem early in the game you want that one big stack to slam into the enemy. And then later, it's going to get harder. Some of the optional rules really change the dynamics in terms of how defensible static locations are. And different players have different counter mixes in terms of fortifications, etc., which can really affect that as well. Anyway, if the components were really good, I think this would be a mediocre game, including a better rulebook. I think this would be a mediocre game with some really interesting facets and something that I would want to come back to again and again. As it is, my experience with it is so unpleasant. I don't know if I'm ever going to play it again. It's just such a chore for what the payoff really is. And so, I didn't mention this, some of the mechanical aspects of the game, having to count up all your counters, for example, in a siege type battle, and then you roll on combat. It's basically a single roll for number of units destroyed, but then when you translate that to the tactical, it just becomes really hideous, because you're rolling 2 dice for each unit that you have on the front, and you check to see how much damage it does, and to the unit it's attacking, and if all the units combined can wipe that out, you get that unit as one of your destroyed units that you get points from the enemy. Well, the problem with that is, first of all, you can't just grab a fistful of dice. It would be much, much better if they weren't using 2d6 for each combat result. And because it means that you're just, you're rolling so many different times over the course of a battle. And you can kind of cheat that a little bit, maybe use a couple different colored dice to handle the attacks, etc. But it's just painful. And then, when you're starting to add the lookups in the rule book, especially if you're playing with the full optional rules and everything, it just really gets ugly. And if you're not playing with the optional rules, I just don't feel like this is, the best vehicle for that type of game. Throughout my playing, I compared it to a few other games. Some of those simple strategic fantasy type games, things like City States of Arclairol, that you can set up, play in a couple hours, and you don't get this kind of more rich experience, and you certainly don't get the hidden stuff and everything, but you get a lot of the, hey, I get to smash, fantasy armies together at whatever level that is, and, some magic and stuff. I'm much more interested in something like Barbarian Kings, which is done on a more minimal scale as well, but that has production and stuff like that. So, and since the players get to in that game get to choose where they start and sort of what pieces they're going to focus on, you're able to get a lot of variety and test out different strategies there without it being as driven by the luck, say, of the victory condition cards, and then the luck of, hey, how did we guess against each other, in that initial setup. On the other hand, I think that games like Scandinavia, which I really like, in terms of the more generic, well, not generic, but fantasy, multiplayer fantasy, or strategic side of things where you're fighting over terrain to get positioning, etc. But that has production as well. Most of these don't have production, so they're more, you can compare them a little better. But I'm trying to think of something that kind of fits under this. And, it's in its own space. It really kind of is. And for that, at least as far as I can tell, and for that, it's of some interest. It's just the burden for figuring out, how to play to begin with, and then actually the mechanical aspects of playing just becomes so tedious and so overwhelming that I just can't really recommend going with this. I think there are some neat ideas in it, but they're not enough to overcome the production flaws, especially those associated with the rulebook itself. And, it's just too many negatives of that nature, and the game stops being fun. And if you're me, you have a really hard time deciding what to do, because you think there are still interesting things to learn about this, and there is something neat about this game, but when you start really looking at it, I just think it loses out pretty heavily in the balance between, do I have a playable, fun game here, something that I can actually cope with, and do I have, and by the way, yeah, never mind, and do I have, just something that doesn't deliver for the amount of effort that you have to put in for it. And the effort is a more painful effort for me than it would be for like a Europa Universalis or something like that, where I had to put a lot of effort in, but that effort was exciting. I'm reading the rule book and trying to figure out, how does that mesh together? Wait a minute, there's a problem there. Okay, this is how I'm going to resolve it. Well, with this, the excitement wasn't there in terms of trying to figure out how things would resolve. It was just kind of a matter of, okay, well, I'm not sure which way this should go, but either way is okay, and I don't really have a clear view of, how to make that judgment. Anyway, should be getting on to something else, I guess. It's a disappointment, and I'm worried. I found out, I thought I didn't have mythology here. It turns out I do, but that's another one, another Yaquinto that got some kind of, this isn't as good as it should be. It's really a problem. Yaquinto tended to have some really cool ideas. Like, I'm thinking their Time War game has some really cool ideas, but in the execution, it comes out kind of flavorless. And that's kind of how I feel about this. I felt like, whatever storyline, and there's a sort of this rich backstory and everything, but the way it's presented in the rule book makes it all kind of feel like a flavorless exercise as opposed to this fantasy, story that's being told in a game. If you look at something like Avalon Hill's Dark Emperor, there's actually a lot less kind of exciting special capabilities there, I think. Certainly less effort to present them. Bokastikian is, somewhat competent, it seems. But that story of what's going on just comes through so cleanly in it and so purely. And I know some people don't like the game very much because of some of the implications that come from that story and the feeling that one player's in control and the other player's not. But the story's still there. And here it's gone. And, why the hell am I playing a game? Well, to a large extent, it's to experience that story, especially if I'm looking at a fantasy or any war game, really. If I'm looking at a pure abstract, well, I'm not quite sure. I'm probably making up a story if that's the case. All right, let's send this up.